room was small, but the sound inside it felt enormous. A single bulb swung above the stage, throwing soft circles of light across faces that had come to hear something they couldn't explain, only feel. There was always that moment, right before the beat dropped, when the air thickened the way summer air does before a storm. You didn't know what was coming, but you knew it would rearrange something in you. And then came that voice, a voice that didn't obey rhythm or rules, a voice that laughed, cracked, growled, pleaded, and preached in the same breath. It didn't sound like rap or blues or gospel, but somehow like all three had collided in an alleyway and decided to walk together. People looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or shout or just stare. Even now, memories of it feel like holding onto a live wire. What kind of life produces a sound like that? What kind of childhood? What kind of hunger? What kind of bruises stay hidden beneath such brilliance? Before the fame, before the headlines, before the fall, there was simply a young man stepping into the light, daring the world to understand him. He began in a corner of Brooklyn where music wasn't a luxury, but a language families used to survive. The sidewalks were cracked, the buildings worn. Yet inside those small apartments lived harmonies that drifted through open windows. His mother worked long hours as a dispatcher, his father for the transit authority, but evenings often belonged to rhythm. Pots tapping like hand drums, cousins humming melodies, someone always laughing too loudly. It was a home stitched together by sound. They called him Rusty, a boy who stayed too dusty, too wild, too uninterested in the neatness adults expected. He wasn't mean, he was simply uncontained. The kind of child who chased noise the way other kids chased daylight. His clothes never quite straight, his smile always a little sideways. He carried an energy that made people look twice. Even discipline couldn't touch him for long. He'd get a scolding, a beating, a warning, and then he'd wander right back into whatever world his imagination had opened that day. Music found him early, not through formal lessons, but through the pulse of his neighborhood. He learned timing from watching older kids breakdance on the corner, mimic rhythm by tapping spoons against kitchen tables. By the time he was 11, someone heard something in him, enough to offer a record deal. He lied about his age, trying to convince them he was 17, but his mother refused. School, she insisted, had to come first. But school couldn't hold him. He drifted through classrooms like a storm cloud, too restless to stay in one place, too smart to be overlooked. When he didn't feel understood, he simply stopped returning. What held him, what grounded him, were his cousins. They were boys who also felt music buzzing beneath their skin. Afternoons were filled with breakbeats, borrowed microphones, and the smoky glow of old kung fu films flickering across cheap TV screens. Those movies gave them new names, new identities, a mythology that matched the weight of the world they carried. From the 5% teachings to the street wisdom passed down by older mentors, he learned a language of symbols, math, knowledge, truth, and wore it like an invisible shield. Together, they formed small groups with big dreams. Force of the Imperial Masters. All in together now. Neighborhood crews that practiced in hallways and taped demos in makeshift studios. He was the performer, the spark, the one who stepped forward when others hesitated. Even then, his voice bent rules. Even then, crowds leaned in. What he didn't yet know was how deeply the industry would test him. How fame would magnify every flaw, every wound, every brilliance. But in those early years, before ambition met machinery, he moved with a purity only the young seem to have. A boy in love with sound, building a world that could hold him. When the world first heard the raw crackle of a Wu-Tang record, it felt like someone had opened a door to a basement no one knew existed. The beat was grainy, the energy unruly, and the voices sounded like they'd been carved from the concrete of New York's forgotten blocks. Behind that chaos was a plan, RZA's blueprint, a vision that stitched 9 men into a single storm. They recorded on low budgets, in cramped rooms, yet the tapes they carried from label to label felt like prophecy. And when the demo for Protect Your Neck hit the streets, something shifted. The city leaned forward. Loud Records signed them on a deal no one else had dared to offer. Freedom. Freedom for every member to chase solo success. Freedom to build an empire piece by piece. Freedom to make music that didn't try to impress radio but tried to speak to the lives that radio ignored. Within months, their debut album became the heartbeat of the East Coast. While the West Coast blazed with bright synths and sun-soaked swagger, these men brought winter, steel lungs, cold stairwells, the echo of hustlers' footsteps after midnight. But one voice cut through even that blizzard. A voice that cracked like old vinyl but carried the joy of a child banging pots in a kitchen. His verses didn't follow logic. They followed instinct. Fans didn't just listen. They laughed, gasped, replayed, tried to imitate, and failed every time. Then came the solo album. A food stamp card on the cover, held with the same pride someone might hold a diploma. It was absurd, brilliant, and painfully honest. The songs were rough and joyful, laced with street humor and sudden wisdom. And the world responded. Platinum sales, worldwide recognition, crowds chanting his name with the excitement of discovering someone who refused to behave the way fame asked him to. Then came Mariah. The fantasy remix shouldn't have worked. A wild, unpredictable rapper paired with one of the world's most polished pop voices. But it did. The moment he muttered that first line, the remix became a cultural landmark. Teenagers blasted it from open car windows. DJs looped it until sunrise. Critics argued about it. Even people who didn't follow hip-hop suddenly knew his voice. Yet beneath all the headlines and late-night jokes, there was another truth he gave. Quietly, constantly, buying homes for family, handing money to neighborhood kids, showing up at hospitals just to check on a little girl he helped save. For all his chaos, people who met him often walked away saying the same thing. He had a generous soul. But with more visibility came sharper lights, louder scrutiny, faster judgment. Success made him a star, but it also made him a target. And somewhere between the laughter, the fame, and the myth, cracks began to form. The first signs of unraveling never arrive as explosions. They appear as small fractures. A missed call, a sleepless night, a habit meant to ease the noise. For him, fame tightened its grip in ways no one around him fully understood. The same unpredictability that made crowds adore him began to worry the people managing stages, contracts, schedules. And slowly, the world that once embraced his chaos started treating it as spectacle. He stumbled through courtrooms, headlines, and nightly news segments. Some charges were small, almost absurd, walking out of a store wearing shoes he hadn't paid for, even with money in his pocket. Others carried weight. Assault accusations, drug possession, threats shouted in anger or panic. Yet each incident felt less like a crime and more like a flare shot into the sky, a warning that something inside him was breaking. The MTV welfare moment pushed everything into a harsher light. Cameras followed him into a limousine, then into a government office, capturing an image America wasn't ready to make sense of. A rising star still collecting food stamps. The clip aired everywhere. Commentators mocked him. Politicians pointed to him as an example of a system failing. And although the moment was layered with irony and confusion, the impact was brutal. Suddenly, he was not merely eccentric. He was a national talking point. The fear came next, a fear he spoke of openly. The government was watching him, he said. The industry was using him. Enemies were multiplying, and danger lived in every shadow. Whether these beliefs were rooted in trauma, addiction, or truth, no one around him could fully untangle. What they did know was that he was spiraling. Getting shot only deepened his sense that the world had turned against him. Rehab should have helped. Instead, it became another door he walked through and then out of, unable to stay still long enough to heal. When he fled the facility and became a fugitive, it felt like the final split between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Even then, he joined Wu-Tang on stage briefly, a ghost moving through familiar light. The crowd roared, unaware he was running from more than the law. Prison carved another layer of damage. He spoke of threats, of guards who taunted him, of inmates who saw him as a target because his name had traveled farther than theirs ever would. The noise in his head grew louder. The medications they gave him dulled him until he barely recognized himself. Fame had once given him a stage. Now it made him vulnerable in a place where vulnerability was fatal. By the time he was released, The light in his eyes had dimmed. He tried to reclaim music, to reconnect with the people who had once lifted him. But his body carried too much exhaustion, and his mind too many storms. He wanted to stay clean, he said, but sobriety made the world too quiet, too sharp, too real. And the cracks that once only whispered now roared. Across the ocean, his voice carried differently. In Europe, in Japan, in pockets of cities he never set foot in, people heard only the brilliance, the wild originality, the freedom to break every musical rule without asking permission. Overseas crowds treated him like a folk hero, a living myth from a land built on rhythm and grit. To them, he wasn't a troublemaker. He was an icon of raw expression, a symbol of America's artistic rebellion. They bought the records, memorized the verses, and came to shows ready to celebrate the unpredictable. But at home, the story was more complicated. America loved him, but America also judged him. The same behaviors that made foreign fans laugh, the outbursts, the wild interviews, the refusal to be polished, became fuel for talk shows and political debates. When the welfare clip aired, it wasn't treated as a quirky contradiction. It was framed as a moral failing. Newspapers didn't ask what pushed a young black artist into a life balanced between survival and stardom. They asked what he represented about poverty, responsibility, and race. Hip-hop journalists defended him, calling him a creative essential, a reminder that art sometimes comes wrapped in disorder. Older fans remembered the neighborhoods he came from and saw the clip as a reflection of the broken systems around him, not a flaw in his character. But mainstream America wanted tidy narratives, heroes or villains, not men who lived somewhere in between. Globally, though, he grew larger in death than he ever was in life. International festivals honored him. DJs in Germany, London, and Brazil played his songs as if keeping his heartbeat alive. Younger artists cited him as influence. Scholars wrote about him. Fans posted stories online, discovering pieces of him long after he was gone. The world outside the United States kept calling him unforgettable. America, in its own way, agreed, but with the hesitation of a nation still trying to understand the man behind the myth. His legacy was split between continents. One version adored, one debated, both incomplete without the other. In the end, his story didn't resolve like a lesson. It ended the way real lives often do, abruptly, imperfectly, with more questions than answers. There was no final speech, no quiet redemption scene, only a man in a recording studio trying once more to shape sound into something that made sense to him. And then the silence came, a silence that felt heavier than the noise he had carried his whole life. But legacies don't live in silence. They live in the echoes people leave behind. His voice still rises in clubs where the floors shake, in cars rolling through old neighborhoods, in headphones worn by kids who weren't alive when he walked this earth. They hear something ancient in him, something unruly and human. They hear the reminder that art doesn't need to fit, that brilliance doesn't need permission, that some spirits are born to move sideways through the world. He left more than albums. He left a blueprint for courage, the courage to be strange, to be loud, to be vulnerable, to be unpolished in a world that worships smooth surfaces. He left stories told in barbershops, backstage rooms, street corners, and family gatherings. Stories about laughter, generosity, mischief, and pain. Stories that refuse to fade. And maybe that is his true legacy. He made people feel, whether joy, confusion, awe, or sadness. He woke something in those who listened. Not many artists can claim that. Even fewer can claim it without trying. If you close your eyes, you can still picture him stepping toward the mic, shoulders loose, smile crooked, ready to surprise the room again. The light above him sways gently, just enough to remind you that some lives, no matter how short, leave a long shadow. If this story brings someone to mind, a musician, a friend, a family member who lived boldly in their